All right, well,
Here and there.
we're now ready to start. My name's Dan Smith. I'm Secretary General of International Alert. And the first thing I want to do, apart from welcoming you to the Frontline Club, is thanking you for making the extra effort to be here. One of our speakers has been making a Herculean effort to be here. He's not one of the ones who's come from Beirut. No, I think he was trying to get here from Piccadilly. And the last message we had said that he was in a bus on Park Lane which was not moving and whose driver has just had a fight with one of the passengers, which suggested to me that we should be there and not here, but you know, you can't do everything in this life. So bear with us. If he arrives, then a chair will magically appear on stage and he will be mic'd up and he'll join in the conversation, and if not, then he won't. Or maybe he'll arrive 10 minutes before the end and feel so fed up with life that he won't want to join in. But anyway. Second thing second, on silent at least. Turned off if you really want to devote your whole mind here, but if you want to keep just 4% of it on the something happening outside, just at least turn it to silent. So welcome to this another Peace Talks in the series organised by International Alert, the second one that has been hosted here by the Frontline Club. And one of the reasons why we wanted to be hosted here by the Frontline Club, I mean, the atmosphere is great, the location is fine, the feeling is really good, and the live streaming is absolutely ace. So this is being live streamed, and then later on we hope we'll be able to put out some edited bits. The invitation for the meeting explained to you what this is about. We don't want to be talking tonight in a way that sort of puts what is actually happening inside Syria to one side. That's not the point. But when there's all the focus on Syria and on the horrors which are happening there, on 9 million people displaced from their homes, 2 million people more than having crossed the borders, every casualty counting at the moment that somewhere in excess of 120,000 people have been killed in the war. The focus gets to be on Syria. And there are bigger dangers as well in the area. And we want to talk about those as well, to be talking about the context, or part of the context in which to be understanding Syria. We're coming up towards the third anniversary of the war, and the war has changed nature, it's changed its face as it has gone along, and maybe we'll be touching upon some of that this evening. We have a superb group here to talk about it. The empty chair, or the empty non-chair, shall I say. Those of you, I know several of you are in government, so you'll be used to the idea of a non-paper. Well, our non-speaker, but he may become a real speaker tonight, is Nadim Shehadi from the Middle East and North Africa program of Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And if he joins us, he'll be sitting at the far end. And if he joins us, next to him will be sitting Julien Barnes-Dacey, who's a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and formerly a journalist based in Syria. Next, sitting in the middle, Martin Chuloff, who's the Middle East correspondent for The Guardian. And sitting next to me is Victoria Stamadianou, who is International Alert's country manager in Lebanon for the work that we've been doing there now. When did we start? 2009? So yep. Been going for about 5 years there. Let's dive straight in. Martin is almost literally just off the plane, having arrived this morning, and Victoria arrived earlier this week on Monday. So I wanted to begin by asking what the atmosphere is in Beirut, which is, after all, a very atmospheric city. Atmosphere is a very important, almost tangible thing in Beirut. So how does it feel in Beirut at the moment, Martin?
Well, good evening, everyone. You're right, Beirut is an atmospheric place. It's an intoxicating place. It has a positive energy. It generally is quite resourceful. It's been through decades of strife before, and it has an inherent sense that this will continue. Despite that, though, I guess what we're looking at now in Lebanon is something which the society hasn't had to confront until this point, and that is quite a potent, venomous Sunni-Shia sectarian sort of tension. And that does underlie a lot of the decision-making or the non-decision making. It influences the atmospherics in the city itself. There have been suicide bombings, there have been assassinations. The streets are quite spooked, they're quite empty. There are lots more checkpoints than there have been in the many years that I've been in the region. And it has a feeling of a place that isn't at ease with itself. I mean, in many ways it never really is, but this seems to be a different layer of complexity that the society doesn't seem to be able to adapt to at this point.
Victoria, is that what you'd have said?
Well, I would pick up on something that Martin was saying there about that it always sort of feels this way. I remember the first time that I arrived to Beirut, and it was 3 years ago, so it was before anything had started. And at that time, the taxi driver on the night of my arrival said to me, "You've picked the worst time to come to Beirut. It's in a crisis." Every time I kept on leaving and coming back to Beirut, it was always in a crisis. So in a sense, it always feels like it's sort of teetering on the edge of chaos. But having said that, I also agree with Martin in saying that there are certain things that sort of feel different, and I think that a couple of incidents that have happened in this month also kind of provide a little bit of a snapshot into that, if you like. And for me, I think it was the week before last, I can't remember, you might remember better than me, but there was a rapper who got arrested last week because he was walking in Harek, which is one of the areas that has been bombed a couple of times in the last few weeks. And I think it really shows, it captures this moment wherein there is so much heightened kind of fear, communitarian fear and vulnerability, and it shows this fear and the rising Islamism. So I think that's one interesting kind of insight into the current moment. But if I can just also add one more. Again, in this month, there was in the news sort of a statement made from a group that was called the Youth of Arsal. Arsal is a town on the border of Lebanon, and it's an area wherein a lot of refugees have flown to in the past few years. It's almost doubled in population since that crisis has started. And the statement read like this: to all the Syrian refugees who own businesses, you have 48 hours to close your businesses, or you will be a legitimate target. So I think it's showing this kind of increasing fatigue that these kind of areas that were already impoverished are beginning to have with.
Is it a process of escalation of risk towards a big explosion?
I think that's an accurate way to frame it. We can't see what's happening in Lebanon, obviously, in isolation from what's taking place in Syria. It bleeds directly into it. But there has been an increased security risk as the nation state of Syria has, I wouldn't say unraveled, but it's certainly been under a lot of pressure. There have been heightened sectarian tensions at various steps along the way. The Hezbollah acknowledging it was playing such a public, proactive role in May last year was a seminal moment. And certainly the start of the suicide bombings in the Hezbollah areas in the last 3 or 4 months has certainly taken things to a new level. But I guess overriding it all is a sense that this isn't going away. This is going to get worse. And that's what people are, I guess, deeply unsettled about, that there doesn't appear to be any limits to how far this could go.
If we sort of just go deeper into this gloom for a moment, could you answer to how long? I mean, how far away is Lebanon from an explosion?
It's difficult to answer that without bringing in Iraq and Syria. It's directly and wholly influenced by the events in the rest of the region. And what I would say, if there isn't a resolution to Syria at some point in the next 2 to 3 years, the real risk, and it's a very significant risk, is that we could head inexorably along a path towards a balkanization of the entire Levant along ethnic sectarian lines. And that would mean the end of the nation state of Lebanon, Syria and Iraq. That's how significant it is at the moment.
Julien, maybe then if I turn to you and bring you in, I mean, as you look at the potential for this cross-border impact of the Syrian conflict, working on the fault lines which exist already, where would you highlight as being the areas to, if you like, be most worried about? Is it Lebanon, or I mean, is it Iraq, or actually should one even be looking further afield?
I think it's Lebanon and Iraq, but I think it's also the entire region in a sense. And I think, you know, we've just heard about Lebanon, Iraq. Someone was telling me this morning that they had 10 suicide bombings there yesterday. You've had the biggest increase in number of attacks since 2007. I mean, Anbar province is on fire at the moment, and the central government is gearing up for an assault there. So you've had a real breakdown of the state there as well. And I think, you know, like in Lebanon, Iraq is directly implicated by what's happening in Syria. And I think, you know, these are associated crises, but they're also crises of the two states. I mean, they're in a sense opening up a can of worms that was open since a long time ago, was never shut. I mean, the question of Lebanon and the balance of power there, you know, they fought a long civil war there. And the same in Iraq. We've seen a recent decrease in violence, but suddenly that is coming to the fore again. And what Syria has done is it's given groups on the ground, in a sense, a reason, a possibility to re-challenge the balance of power on the ground. And whether it's Sunnis in Lebanon or the Sunnis in Iraq, they see what's happening in Syria as a means of empowerment, both materially but ideologically, to kind of re-challenge or challenge what has been established there of late. But I think the other big explosion and big worries is a broader regional picture. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the battle between the Iranians and the Saudis, and I think that is something that is coming increasingly to the fore. Syria is a strategic country for both of them. Both of them have increasingly invested in the battle. They see it as very much a zero-sum battle for power, and it's about regional control first and foremost. But as Martin says, I think it's becoming increasingly sectarian. And, you know, they are using sectarian forces for their own political ambitions. I mean, they want control of the region, and their ideological religious lines mean they play it along sectarian lines. And so I think, you know, the fact that has been unleashed now in countries like Lebanon and in Syria, where sectarianism was an undercurrent of what was happening politically, but it wasn't on the surface as it is today. And, you know, that unraveling, as much as a nation state, in terms of what Martin was talking about, the kind of balkanization along ethnic sectarian lines, could really, you know, we're talking about from the Mediterranean all the way over to Iraq in really dangerous ways, and this could still get a lot worse.
So in one way, I mean, Syria is like the arena in which these rivalries are being fought out. Yeah, Saudi has become a major player now in the Syrian conflict, or is becoming a major player, and Iran has been for a while anyway.
Yeah, I mean, my view is Iran's been there, you know, for a long time, and the Saudis since day one were quite keen. Other Gulf countries and the Turks were also involved there. I mean, this is not just the Iranians and the Saudis, and the Saudis have actually, in a sense, come to it later than the likes of the Qataris. But clearly, it's seen as a strategic, you know, where Syria goes, the region goes to a lot of these players.
Syria is the proxy battleground between those two regional powers. Lebanon is a contest, I guess, on more political lines. The Saudis in particular are heavily invested in Lebanon, and they do believe that Iran has got one over on them in Iraq, is getting one over on them in Syria, and they don't want to lose Lebanon from their orbit, so they're investing all they can politically into ensuring that they have significant influence in the makeup of any government there.
I mean, several years ago, a Lebanese journalist, I must admit, a rather tired and cynical one, said that if you wanted to understand Lebanese politics, it was basically Iran and Syria on the one hand and Saudi and Israel on the other. And that was the sort of the lineup of forces. And that's also an odd bit of this whole equation, is where Israel fits into that picture of the broader regional dimensions.
I mean, I don't think Israel really fits in at all.
Okay.
I think Israel is interested in its own tactical, you know, it will bomb if it sees missiles coming near its borders, but Israel is very wary. Israel doesn't know if it's better to be with Assad and the Iranians in Syria, or to have what it sees as the potential for jihadist Al-Qaeda types ultimately controlling the country and turning their eyes on Israel. So I think Israel feels it from a strategic perspective. It doesn't know which is better. It can do very little to shape it. therefore let's just concentrate on the tactical imperatives of our security today, tomorrow, and we'll deal with what comes, and they feel confident.
I broadly agree with that. And I mean, if you look at the state of Israel, what are its strategic imperatives in the short term? And that is keeping their borders as safe as possible. The Golan border with Syria was the safest border they had for 40 odd years. They were more or less comfortable with Hafez al-Assad and Bashar, and to the extent that they have intervened in the Syrian conflict, it has been going after tactical weapons, bombing weapons that they believe could pose a threat to them. They are vexed by it, but I think there is more or less a consensus within the security establishment that it was better the devil they know. They don't want their, potentially tens of thousands of jihadists on the Golan Heights.
Right. And then just to keep this going, just one step wider, what we loosely refer to as the Al-Qaeda associated groups and so on, Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, and such groups are known, amongst other things, for their recruitment from very broad areas and redeployment of fighters recruited in one place into another. Is that also an issue which is of strategic significance, or strategic and political significance for the region at the moment?
Well, certainly the rise of the Islamists in northern Syria has changed the equation for the opposition, for the Americans, and to the extent that they were interested in taking a stake. It's posed a significant threat to the Turkish border. It's absolutely splintered the opposition, and it has reaffirmed the Assad narrative to the extent that they've said from the beginning that they were fighting jihadists. They weren't at the beginning, but they partly are now.
Right.
And they are using this to go to Europe, to go to America, saying, look guys, it was always about this. Help us, we have a common enemy here. Let's unite to fight them. So it's complicated the civil war immensely, no doubt about that.
And this is a discourse that Hezbollah is also able to pick up on to justify their implication in the Syrian battleground at the moment.
Okay, well, we've taken one sort of round through the problems and the multiple layers and diverse geographic, geostrategic locations of it. And in a few minutes, I'm going to start asking audience for questions, so start thinking them up and be ready to pose them. But before doing that, I want to take another stab, so a different aspect of this, so put on a completely different mood, because the question which I want to ask, and I don't want to get the word nothing in reply, is, well, what can be done? Victoria.
How much time do you have?
We've got a fair bit of the evening.
So as you know, being part of a peace-building organization, we would never say nothing. We always have some kind of solution.
Optimism is part of the personal characteristics you need for the profession.
So there. I will just focus on three stakeholders that I have in mind very quickly. I think that one thing that needs to happen, at least from the context of Lebanon, where sort of I'm involved, certainly the political elite and the public officials need to get their act together and to, come around the table, form a cabinet, and start to deal with the crisis and give it the gravity that it merits. So that's one thing. The other thing is the religious leaders, and they play a very significant role in the country's socio-political fabric. So I think it's quite important for them to dialogue and to actively take a role in sort of trying to diffuse these inflammatory types of speeches that we're seeing from different kinds of, sheikhs here and there. And the third one is the biggest, I think, thing that is kind of very feasible, and this is about the role of the agencies and the INGOs that are either financing or implementing the response to the Syrian refugees crisis in Lebanon. And it's sort of their responsibility to start off. I think they're now discovering, they've already realized actually that they can't go about things doing relief as usual, business as usual. It is going to require a very different kind of approach to solving this problem to the extent that it's possible. And we're certainly talking about, as everybody has already mentioned, a protracted refugee crisis. So integrating the relief agenda with the development agenda and integrating peace-building principles with that is very important. And at the moment in Beirut, and I'm saying this sort of from personal experience, although the principles of conflict sensitivity are globally accepted, there's a lot of reluctance from the side of agencies to adopt these and to operationalize these. And actually, agencies do need to make a very serious commitment to this that will result in institutional changes in the way that they operate, in appropriate resource allocation, while of course always taking into account the primacy of the life and death situation that is playing out on the borders.
What kind of agencies are you referring to? Government agencies, UN agencies, NGO agencies?
Yeah, and
all of them.
The agencies that are financing and the agencies that are implementing. So both bilateral and multilateral, from the European Union, the World Bank, the UN agencies, and then the different governments that are involved in this.
Okay. And what is actually happening, Martin, with the refugees who are coming into Lebanon? Because my understanding is that in Jordan, you're seeing Syrian refugees coming into camps, right? But that in Lebanon, to the degree the decision has been taken, it's not to have camps.
And that's because the state doesn't want anything like a permanent structure.
Which it's got already with the Palestinian refugees.
Correct. And who are not necessarily integrated into the state of Lebanon. They're by and large living in camps. They're denied access to 70 forms of employment, and they are not functioning members of a state. The Syrian refugees, the same sort of thing. I mean, we should bear in mind that the demographics of the country are so fragile, and that anything like a census probably couldn't be held, because it would just reflect the power balance of the Sunnis, the Shias, the Christians, the Druze, or whatever, and those numbers are so bitterly contested because they translate directly into power and political influence. So when it comes to the Syrian refugees, most of whom are Sunnis, they are being assimilated where they can be into northern Lebanon, into Akkar and into the Bekaa Valley. Some are establishing sort of shantytown areas in the Bekaa Valley. Others are sleeping rough in Beirut. There are roughly 1 million of them. They're being more or less provided for by the aid agencies, but it's a huge struggle, and it's every day it appears to be edging closer to a tipping point.
Let's do just a bit of the numbers game. Syrian population is usually reckoned to be around 23 million pre-war, of whom around 9 million have been displaced from their homes, of around 2 million have crossed borders, therefore qualifying as refugees, of whom about 1 million have gone into Lebanon, whose population is?
About 4.5.
So and in addition to that 4.5, there are Palestinian refugees numbering about?
400,000.
Right. So you have 4.5 million plus 10% Palestinian refugees, and on top of that, plus another 20%, which is Syrian refugees. So if one is to think about, what the situation of Lebanon is, those percentages help explain some of the dilemmas it faces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's and look, Lebanon remains by and large the easiest spot for many of these refugees to get to, and so these numbers will continue, and so too will the untenable load on an already feeble state. And this is an enormous problem. It's something that people really don't have a solution to. I mean, there are projections from the UNHCR that, as you said, there are around about 6 million internally displaced in Syria at the moment, that a large number of those may try to get to Lebanon this year.
Yeah.
And so what will that do to a system that already isn't coping?
Yes, I mean, the UN projections seem to go for through this year an even higher number of total displaced, and a much larger number also crossing the border. So let's go back to that then. What can be done? There's flood of refugees into Lebanon. Let's not mince words, even if it sounds kind of alarmist. But what's the way to address or to help address that set of issues?
Well, I mean, I think clearly the only solution is a Syrian solution. I mean, Syria is sucking the life out of the region. It's Syria that is provoking the refugee crisis, you know, and until that situation is resolved, you're not going to get a regional resolution to all of the accompanying issues. And, you know, it's, in a sense, Syria has sucked the life out of the region for so long, and now I'm worried that there's blowback in the sense the area is being pushed back out right across. So that is the main thing, and I think, you know, it is the problem from hell, of course, and there are no easy solutions. I think there are a lot of band-aid solutions that one can do in the short term, and I think, you know, the refugee issue is clearly one of them in terms of Lebanon, in terms of Turkey, in terms of Jordan, which incidentally is actually one of the few countries that has probably been stabilized by the Syria crisis, not destabilized, but maybe we can talk about that later. But so there's the humanitarian aid, there's getting medicine, access of humanitarian goods into Syria itself. I mean, today there was some movement, it seems, on the Homs situation, that perhaps there'd be some people there. So I think, you know, Western governments can do that. There's a sense in the West that perhaps you can strengthen the security services in Lebanon and Iraq, the Lebanese army, the Iraqi army. Arguably counterproductive if both of those organizations are politicized, but that's another thing. But at the end of the day, I mean, these are just temporary measures. I think, you know, the only thing that matters is solving the Syria crisis. There's no easy solution. I mean, my view is that the only place you can start is by squeezing the regional players to squeeze their own proxies on the ground within Syria, within Lebanon, within Iraq. I think that, you know, the level of polarization, of hatred, of growing sectarianism means that the fighting is not going to end anytime soon. But I think until you get a shift in terms of the sense that actually these parties think they can win, and they think they can win because of their backing from abroad, I think, you know, until that incentive structure changes, so people realize that they have to think about, well, we have to negotiate. There's no, you know, we're not going to win this. Our backers aren't going to back us to the hilt. There's no other way out, I think. So I would say that, you know, you start at the Iranian-Saudi level, you try and squeeze in, and then you bring in the other players, and you squeeze in until you get to the domestic players. I think, you know, for me, that's the only viable path. And I know a lot of people push for the military track, and Nadim may have words on that, I'm sure. But I mean, to my mind, I mean, the Iranians are full in, the Hezbollah is full in, the Saudis are full in. I mean,
right.
You can feed this fire, you know, until everything breaks down, and I don't see how that actually serves the purpose of de-escalation, or actually, you know, to my mind, the more you push it, the more people feel they can win.
Okay, we're going to take a tube strike break now, and allow Nadim Shehadi to join us on the panel. Hi, come on in. The plight you were in has been understood, reported, sympathised and empathised with by everybody here assembled. And of course the first question I'm going to ask is, well, Nadim, what do you think? Okay. Give you a chance to catch your breath.
I agree with that.
There you go. Safest line. Give you a chance to catch your breath, have a drink of water. And where we really are, it seems to me, if I just build from what you said, Julien, is that the only real solution to this whole situation comes in a settlement in Syria. There is not a short-term prospect of a settlement in Syria. There's a lot of hard diplomatic graft, a lot of hard political graft to do in order to get there. So in the meantime, an awful lot of shoring up of the situation in the surrounding countries which are most at risk needs to be done. Right? Is that a fair enough gloss on what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we are. That's the reality of the situation. Right. I would say that a lot more needs to be done on the Syria situation than is being done.
Right.
But that's probably where we stand, and it's probably as good as we're going to get.
Right. And so, in terms of that, the expression I use of shoring up the neighbours, it's essentially we're talking about Lebanon, which is not so very far away from a major crisis, and Iraq. Is that right? Or have we got more candidates?
No, I would say those two countries, and I would say both of them are in crisis. I mean, Turkey, I would say is a different scenario. I think they have huge political internal issues. I think the refugee situation, but it doesn't strike me as being so kind of existential to stability in the same sense.
So Nadim, if you've caught your breath enough, give us your gloss on what where we've got to in the discussion.
Well, I don't think dealing with the symptoms is going to do any good, because the symptoms are only going to grow worse. And thinking of a long-term solution through the Geneva process, especially a kind of de-escalation, which I've discussed with Julien many times, and a compromise with Assad, in a sense, is going to lead nowhere, because the logical end of this is the rehabilitation of Assad, which is impossible. So, if you think of a successful de-escalation with money pouring in for reconstruction and relief and rehabilitation, with Assad there, it will have to go through Assad, and it will not go through Assad. So, if you're relying on Arab money as well, if you want. So I think dealing with the crisis in Syria is much more important than dealing with the symptoms.
Victoria, you're working in a symptom country. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. You have to deal with it in the root, but Lebanon already, and I don't know if Nadim agrees with this, but Lebanon already has its own deficiencies that are currently just being kind of played upon even more. So from the perspective of somebody who's working in Lebanon on a peace-building program before the Syrian crisis, there was a lot to do then. There's still a lot to do now.
From your perspective, is the lot more that there is to do now a kind of simply an extension of the problems that there were before, or is there something qualitatively new that is unfolding in Lebanon at the moment that we're dealing with in our work there?
There's certainly an extension of the same problems, but I think the new is, it's going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, but the new part of it is that I think that there are new opportunities to get to more structural issues that before might have been blocked.
Okay. Martin, you got a view on that?
Just in terms of you asked earlier, is there anything like a solution? And I guess trying to cherry pick anything that could be done to slow this momentum. I personally think that it would be worthwhile for Iran to take a significant seat at the table at this point. I agree with Nadim, it's no point in dealing with symptoms here. This crisis is much bigger than any of these nation states. It does play directly to the regional overlords. If we look back to last September, in the lead up to the cancelled US strike, there was a perception in the region that the threat was credible, and it did lead to the chemical weapons being withdrawn, and it also led to, more importantly in my view, everybody looked down their barrels, including Iran, Russia and America, and they didn't like what they saw, because they realised that, what is next? It could get exponentially worse, and that did create a window for discussions with Iran over the nuclear file. Now, whether you agree with what took place there or not, the fact is that there were negotiations, and I do think that potentially could segue into a discussion on Syria too. It would require a great leap of faith, but I do think that they need a seat at the table, because they do understand that this is far bigger than anybody can control.
Okay, let's open out and find out what questions people have and see if the panel can handle any of them. There's one from over there. Could you wait for the microphone to come and then just tell us very quickly who you are and then ask your question?
Grish Gregorian. My question is mainly to come back to the Saudi aspect of this whole scenario. From the eyes of the Iranians, they've got three main Shia majorities in the region. They've got Bahrain, they've got Lebanon, and they've got Iraq. But they have tried to dominate for simple reason, when the Iraq war happened, it was mainly by Saudi and Gulf money that was towards Iran. So therefore, it was after the war that they tried to start to put roots in these areas in order to make sure that they're not, nobody's able to again destabilize the nation as they try to do so. Now, in the Western world, the Saudi aspect of the whole thing in the Syrian war, not only in the Syrian war, in the whole region, from the Caucasus to the north, to Pakistan and Afghanistan to the east, to southern Bahrain and Oman and Yemen, the Saudis are stretching their roots in order to make powerful, friendships with whoever wants to be their friends. My question is, why isn't the West seeing the fact that the Saudis are playing a very, very dirty war against people who are not really the enemy of the West, but they're creating enemies because of the Saudis?
Okay. Can I just ask you, when you said, when you mentioned the Gulf War there, you meant the first one between Iraq and Iran?
Iraq, yes. That was mainly financed by the Gulf.
Because I saw a look of confusion on people's faces as they thought about it.
Iran and Iraq war.
Yeah. Who wants to take a stab at that? Why is the West not talking as in the way that the questioner thinks should be talking about Saudi Arabia?
Because they're friends.
Well, I mean, they're obviously, they're historic allies. There's a long history of relations there.
They're big customers.
I think that they're both big customers and big oil providers, of course, and these things matter, whatever one thinks. The Saudis are people that the West, by and large, thinks they can do business with, and I think the West has felt that the Saudis, though problematic on a lot of issues, has helped deliver and stabilize on other issues. Personally, I think this is very problematic. I think the Saudis are hugely problematic in the region. I think they are not playing a positive role, whether in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. And I think, if you're going to talk about, the negative actors of the likes of Hezbollah or Iran, the Saudis need to be brought into that equation. And until there's pressure brought on them, I don't think that you have a sense of changing the mood in the region. But perhaps we're seeing the beginning of that with this shift by the Americans towards the Iranians, and obviously we're seeing a lot of fears from Riyadh about what that means.
I was wondering whether anybody thinks there's been a shift in the Western perception of Saudi Arabia following the Saudi decision to reject not to go for the position on the Security Council, because that was seen as being a major kind of statement by Saudi Arabia of its discontent and indeed contempt for Western policy.
Well, certainly I think the Saudis think there is a shift, so that's important. But going back to Syria, Saudi plays a minor role in Syria compared to Iran. The militias that are there from Lebanon and from Iraq are in effect Iranian Revolutionary Guards, financed and armed and trained and commanded by Iran. So Iran is fully part of the conflict militarily as a state. The Saudis are supporting the FSA, which the West supports too, ineffectively in a way. So I think in that sense, one has to see the Saudi role from that angle. Yeah.
Take another question, one here.
I'm Sarah Williams. I'm a journalist. I just spent the last half of last year in Jordan, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on your comment about how Jordan may have been stabilized by this.
Right.
I think that I was spending a lot of time in Jordan in 2011, 12, and things were really rough then. The 12, 13, there was a lot of unprecedented domestic pressure against the king. For the first time, slogans in terms of the king's own position were being chanted openly. You had unrest in the south from the tribes. You had the Muslim Brotherhood feeling more empowered, and there was a real sense that the royal palace was under siege and potentially would face a real threat. And I think that what Syria has done has been to quell that. And I think though the economic problems remain, though the issues of corruption remain, the general sense in Jordan at the moment is that, well, this is better than what's happening in Syria and we don't want to risk that, on the one hand. And secondly, one of the big problems the Jordanians had in 2012, 2013 was that the Gulf countries weren't pumping money into them. There were issues between Amman and the Qataris, Amman and the Saudis, in large measure because the Jordanians wouldn't respond as the Gulf states wanted on Syria in terms of opening up the border, in terms of arms flows, etc. And for a country like Jordan, which is so dependent on external revenues, that made a huge difference if you weren't getting these billions from the Gulf. But because of what's happened of late, because the Jordanians have been more willing to shift position there, the Gulf countries have decided to give more money. The West has also quietened down in terms of any questioning of, well, the king needs to reform, the king needs to do this. So actually the king is under a lot less domestic, regional and international pressure, and the street is a lot quieter. And, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood, discredited by what's happened in Egypt.
So, I mean, is part of the effect is a kind of deterrent effect because you see what happens in Syria and therefore you don't want to push in anything like the same direction in Jordan. Yeah?
I think on the street, although it's worth saying that this is a short-term thing. I mean, in the long term, you've got the refugees, you've got Islamists, you've got the breakdown. I mean, the king has huge economic problems, so it's not to say that the king is over, but I think...
In the same way as the chaos in Iraq, in a way, consolidated some of the regimes in the region, and they contributed to the chaos in Iraq because they knew that it would consolidate them. Right. So Syrian contribution to what happened in Iraq between 2006 and 2008, and Iranian contribution, and I think most of the region wanted Iraq to fail in order to deter any internal uprising. The fall of Saddam Hussein was very symbolic, I think, in that sense.
And today, with Syria, is that deterrent effect wider in the region? I mean, you've mentioned Jordan, but is there are other cases where this seems to be, or might be thought to be the case?
Just thinking out loud, I wouldn't have thought so. I certainly agree with Julien about Jordan and the deterrent factor there. The street is far more stable than it was in 2012. Mm-hmm. But elsewhere, I guess it's if you look at Turkey. I mean, there's certainly a sizable minority, if not a small majority, who's upset with Turkey's Syria policy there. Iraq has been unsettled deeply. We've talked about Lebanon, and I don't think the rest of the region necessarily plays directly to it. It does in terms of the broader overall Shia-Sunni thing, but not in terms of its concerns as a nation state.
Okay, great. Another question down the front, and then after that, we're going to jump to the back and take questions from there.
My name is Anne Lapping. We've been talking, or you've been talking, very much in terms of power politics, leaders, warlords, as it were, in the region. But lying behind all that is the Sunni-Shia rift. And is that, in a sense, that might, rather than Syria, be the core problem? And is there any way that the West can help confront, mediate that? Or is it the cynical position of the West that if the Sunnis and Shias go for each other, that's not bad for the West?
Martin?
Well, my take on that is that although the doctrinal split that we know well sort of overrides it, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Syria in the last 3 years, and let's go back to the early months of the uprising. It was never, even in those days when people used to talk about the Shias or the Alawites, it was never about the theology or the doctrine. It was always about the politics that were hinged to it. And as the war has ground on, that remains the case. In fact, even more so. It's about the alliances that have been formed between the Revolutionary Guards, the Alawite regime, and Hezbollah, between the Qataris and the Muslim Brotherhood. Throw in Al-Qaeda there as well. And you know, these battle lines have been formed more along, I guess, straight-up regional political lines than an ancient theological schism. To the extent that your question, would the West benefit from both sides having, an apocalyptic show at each other? I don't think so, because that is far bigger than anybody can control. If that really does expand around the region. That is a nightmare scenario for everybody concerned, every single stakeholder in the region and beyond, including Europe, Russia, and America,
and Pakistan, and
Pakistan, absolutely.
India. But I think the Shia-Sunni rift is overplayed when Erdogan of Turkey and Hamad of Qatar and also Abdullah of Saudi Arabia were supporting Assad. It was not because he was Shia or because they were Sunni.
Because he was stable.
It was because they thought they could do business with him, and so did France. So his best friends in the world were France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Who in fact rehabilitated him after he was isolated, and then in 2011, I think they realized that you cannot do business with Assad. It took them a while. They didn't start cutting off relations with him until September, and they were in fact influencing the United States to cool down its attack on him, especially the Turks, until September. So there, it's nothing to do with Shia Sunni, and in fact the Sunni countries are opposed to the Brotherhood. Most of the Sunni countries, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Qatar is a special case. They had the Brotherhood descend on them with Al Jazeera, and it was the equivalent, I think, of the impact on Britain of the Central European intellectuals coming here. They had an impact and they influenced. So,
I'll just add to that by saying that while I agree with that analysis, and it wasn't the cause of this conflict wasn't sectarian. What sustains it in part certainly is.
It's the exploitation of
very deliberately.
Very deliberately.
I mean, I think this is one thing. I mean, I completely agree with Martin's analysis about it being a regional power play and regional alliances, but it's very clear that those alliances are using sectarian networks to achieve their political ambitions.
Correct.
And that's a dangerous thing. And then you point to the scenario that Martin talks about, is where effectively this gets unleashed. And I think the danger that you see today and potentially going forward is, I mean, once this is out of the box, it does become more powerful. It does gain a life of its own in a situation where you're fighting for your life, where you're under siege. I mean, in these kind of circumstances, your religion, sectarian differences in a place like Syria becomes very acute and very important. And so I think there's a danger that what was instrumentalized becomes something real.
In fact, on a smaller than such a large region or scale, right, there's numerous examples of it turning out that trying to exploit religious difference or ethnic difference in order to gain legitimacy, you get onto the back of a tiger, and it may soon throw you off and devour you. We've seen that in South Asia, we've seen that in parts of Africa, we've even seen that in Southeastern Europe. And so that is, yes, it starts in one guise and transforms. I think one of the important things to understand about conflicts of this scale and complexity is it doesn't stand still. And one of the difficulties for all of us actually is that the analysis which we made and felt comfortable with, and that was a really good piece I remember reading back in September or October, is by February already beginning to get a bit rusty and frayed around the edges. Take another first hand I saw at the back there. Put your hand up again. Yes. And then you can hang around at the back with the mic, because I'm sure there's a couple of others who want to ask questions. Go ahead.
I'm Julia McFarlane, I'm a journalist as well, and I wanted to ask Nadim, just to bring it back to Lebanon, we always talk about how the conflict is spilling over into Lebanon in particular, but how much is the conflict in Lebanon down to its own internal strife? And we always talk about Tripoli as an example of this. But then, the Alawites in Jabal Mahsen are funded by Rifat Aid in the Lebanese Democratic Party, and the Sunnis in Bab al-Tabana are funded by Sunni businessmen. How much can we put this down on, obviously it's related, but how much is this down to Lebanese politics and Lebanese conflict rather than a spillover effect from Syria?
You might all want to have a stab at that, so Nadim, begin.
Yeah. I mean, the Alawites in Jabal Mahsen are not funded by Rifat Aid. They are hostages to Rifat Aid. he creates the conflict that makes them depend on him for protection, and that's very much a Assad tactic. I mean, you create the fire and you sell you sell the water. Now in Lebanon, what we really have is paralysis. We have a system that goes into gridlock because of so many checks and balances. It's impossible for one party to prevail over all the others because of this agreement and the checks and balances. So we go into paralysis. So we've lost the state is effectively no longer there, and society is holding as much as it can without that, and this situation cannot continue in Lebanon like that. I mean, it's very dangerous. And
Victoria, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So just to repeat the question again, it's almost like an equation. You know, how much of this problem is there already, and how much of this problem in Lebanon is a new creation as a result of the Syrian. Yeah.
It's a version of what I asked you before. Is it kind of quantitatively worse, or is it qualitatively different?
I think it's largely something that was there to begin with. It's part of the structure, part of the system. It has very much to do with sort of a suprastructure that has been almost imposed and taken over also by this kind of sectarian representation that is sort of taken over government, and then all the things that link to that with paralysis, political paralysis and checks and balances. But the extent to which this system is then utilized by different power players to forward their own personal interests and then sort of sell them as their community's interests, this political entrepreneurialism is something that has always been the case, and is in their interest to maintain a state that is weak in this sense so as to kind of continue their place in power.
If I may add to that, what we saw as the endemic Lebanese problem for the last century, basically Lebanon skipped the 20th century. It never became a 20th century state, and it was considered as a failed 20th century state. As compared to Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Tunis, Libya, who were successful 20th century states. So these components that we thought were the failure of Lebanon are what's holding it together now, because Lebanon as a society can live without state because it never had any.
Exactly.
And it is ahead of the game in the sense that the region is dismantling these powerful states. We don't have to dismantle it. They have to get used. They have to get used to living without it. They have to find a way of agreeing how to share power. Like in Iraq, this is the problem now. If they can agree how to share power and how to share the wealth, and how to prevent one party from taking over, then Iraq would be in a better place. In Lebanon, they already know that, but still. The problem is overwhelming for the whole economy and for society. And it also depends how one interprets President Assad's statement when he says that if he is destabilized, the whole region will go up in flames. Is this political analysis, or is this a threat? Is this meaning that I will bring down the region with me? I can create Al-Qaeda, I can destabilize Lebanon, I can activate all the problems that I have control over. So depending on what your answer to the question is, dealing with Assad depends on that.
Changes shape, yeah. But to go back one step in that, I mean, Martin, one of the things which almost everybody comments on about Lebanon, if you visited there for a while or you've lived there for a long time, or indeed if you're Lebanese, is about its extraordinary resilience. And that's maybe also something to do with this paradox of what makes it weak makes it strong.
Agreed. Yep. Yeah, it never has been a functional nation state. It's almost been tribes with flags in many ways, and the people have never had to rely on a state because the state's never been there to serve them. So that does add a layer of resilience. The Lebanese are also very resourceful. They've got an enormous diaspora that effectively acts as a de facto state in sending money home to families. It's a social welfare system that isn't provided by anyone else. So, yeah, it perversely, as Nadim says, it could end up being a strength if the rest of the region continues to disintegrate.
Can I just
Yeah.
say one thing about that? I think that it's important to remember, though, that resilience is depletable. So these kind of networks that have been mobilized in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, and we've seen a lot of the refugees being hosted by communities. Everybody expected that there would be massive conflict across the country, and that hasn't happened 3 years into the Syrian crisis. They've managed to be resilient, but that's something that can be depleted and needs to be strengthened.
I think the other thing about resilience is that we often take it as being a positive quality in and of itself under any circumstance, but bad things can be resilient as well.
It could be stagnation.
Yes, exactly. Let's take another question again. If there's one towards the back, no, there's not. So, no, yes, there is. Just in time. You got to be quick in this game, or else we jump back down to the front.
Hi there.
I think there was one over here for the next one.
Lucy Ashton, can we just go back to Iran a second? You talked about how the chemical weapons and discussions over the chemical weapons, we might find that it segues into discussions or opens a door for discussions about Syria. My understanding was that Rouhani is kind of the chemical weapons sort of falls within his mandate, but what's going on in Syria sort of belongs rather more to the Revolutionary Guard. Do you really realistically think that he can get a handle on the Revolutionary Guard and be able to kind of get into some talks?
Do you think that's the right reading, Julien?
Well, I think that so long as the deal on the table is something that Iran cannot accept, he will clearly say, this is not I can't deal with this, this is the Revolutionary Guard. I mean, he's not going to, at the moment he has created this image of you can do business with him, you can do business on the nuclear deal, he's changing Iran. Why would he take on, in a sense, the Syria file if it's only to deal with an opposition, with a Gulf, with a West, which is saying this isn't about deal making, this is you must accept this solution. So I think, Rouhani is also a politician, and he will take and play off what is politically better for him. So if there comes a moment where actually he is, where the negotiating space, where Geneva 3 or 4, whatever it is, actually brings in the Iranians and says, well, what is the deal we can strike for all of our mutual interests? I bet you Rouhani will then have the space to make a deal. So I think it's about what he's given and what the space that he is able to take from the deal making, which will determine whether he can take it, whether the Khamenei allows him to take it, whether the Revolutionary Guard allow him to take it.
But that space is presumably also determined by what happens inside Iran, in Iranian politics, and especially in the economy over the next 3-4 years.
I think we've never tried to make. I mean, this has been an existential zero-sum battle over Syria for a long time, and the Iranians are one side, the others are on the other side. There's been no middle ground. Take away the morality of it. But if you're just talking about deal making, there's been no no middle ground in terms of what that deal would look like. So I don't know if we can, is it that Iran needs to change, or is it that actually there needs to be a deal that Iran's interests match? And I think that, the Iranians clearly see that this isn't doing them well in the region. They're losing economically, militarily. Hezbollah is really weakened from this. So I think they'd be quite keen to strike a deal, but it's a deal that has to suit them as much as the West and the opposition.
Unless they're playing good cop, bad cop. Rouhani plays the good cop, and Soleimani plays the bad cop, and the good cop always tells you, don't put too much pressure on me, deal with me, because otherwise the bad cop will prevail.
But to what end? But good cop, bad cop to what? I would say because they want a deal.
Because they want a deal on the nuclear.
On Syria,
to decrease the pressure on their economy, while they are asking for a free hand in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in other places, because they refuse to tie the two deals together.
I would dispute free hand, but
yeah.
Martin, find the space for negotiation between them.
Well, I think it's an important distinction to draw. The Revolutionary Guards and its the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards and its influence, which goes straight down to Ali Khamenei through Qasem Soleimani and Rouhani. Does Rouhani have any room to move diplomatically? I think the way these two gentlemen framed it was accurate, in that he is being presented as I guess an acceptable, viable face of diplomacy, which would reflect the fact that the Quds Force, or Ali Khamenei and Soleimani, do want to move to some kind of a deal on their terms, and solely on their terms. I don't yet think that they've got to a point where they're prepared to make substantive concessions, but they do want to find some kind of a solution in Syria, because I think that they are aware that in the long run, this is mutually assured destruction, and that doesn't suit their strategic interests.
Won't suit anybody. No. There was a hand here. Ilaria? Go ahead.
Carl Al-Khawairi from Levant TV. Marhaba, Mr. Nadim. I would like to ask you, and I asked this question up in Durham about 3 years back in the very minute when President Mubarak stepped down, and I was asking about a possible post-Mubarak era and minority rights. And we've seen under the Muslim Brotherhood a lot of violations of minority rights and women's rights as well. So I would like to ask the same question about a possible, albeit not very realistic, at least in the near future, post-Assad era in Syria and minority rights, particularly the Christians and the Kurds. So,
have you post-Assad Syria?
Post-Assad Syria is going to be a country where the minorities emerge. I mean, if you look at the way the opposition is composed, it's all the elements that have been suppressed by Ba'ath ideology. The tribes with flags that Martin talked about, they were suppressed. They're pre-modern. I mean, Assad is the quintessential modern state, secular, homogenizing, and suppressing all these ethnic parties, religious parties, feudal families, Kurds, and everybody. So these are the ones that are now bouncing back. So if I mean, my definition of the Arab Spring is that it is a spring like this one, and if you suppress it for 50 years,
it pings back.
It pings back, and that's what's happening. It is all my and Assad is saying that without me, these springs will go out of control, and I'm the one who's protecting them, and so it depends what narrative one believes.
Julien?
It's just, I mean, could you flip that the other way? I mean, Assad himself has is from a minority, and it's been a minority-based regime for some time, and I think even today he is exploiting the minorities to try and solidify his position. So I almost wonder if it will be the exact opposite. Will it be about majoritarianism? I mean, this is surely the revolt of the Sunnis, who for how long have been suppressed and driven out of power. So I'm not so sure which way that will play. I agree that minorities, the Kurds and other groups are playing more of a role, but I think the big question that we're seeing both in Syria but also in Iraq and Lebanon is the Sunnis rising up in a sense and trying to strike back and assert their rights and their privileges. And so I wonder if it's the other way around. I mean, in terms of where Syria goes after this, or ends if it ends, I would look at the Lebanon model, which despite all its weaknesses and problems, I wonder if a Syrian Taif is effectively where this ends.
Martin, your take on that?
I just think these are troubling times for minorities, and it requires a great leap of faith at this point to think that there's a better outcome for them downriver. It's not to say that there won't be, but for now, I guess they're retreating to sectarian positions, which is quite a normal thing to do. Sectarian identities, I should say, and they're just waiting to ride this out. And what society emerges from the ruins of Syria will be very, very keenly watched by the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, and the Kurds.
Let's take another question. There was one right in the middle there. Just put your hand up.
Hi, my name is Tanya Mecklenburg. I work as an independent conflict advisor. I'm just trying to sort of what's the so what, which you have alluded to, Dan, which is what can we actually do about all this? You know, we can agree that the region has been quite resilient, and yes, the resilience can wear out, but actually it can live with conflict for quite a long time. So what can we do? Except for just saying we all agree that it's terrible, and we all can watch the news and say it's terrible. So any concrete suggestions?
Right. Back to what can we do, and the word nothing is banned. We'll start with you again, Victoria.
Okay, yeah.
For example, one of the groups of actors that you talked about to begin with was the political leaders and the sort of in Lebanon, the dialogue and so on. Does that also apply in some sort of way, if not in the leadership group, some kind of political dialogue with Syrian groups? What can actually be done, even in a small way? Small steps or big steps, yes.
There are different things that can be done, I think, in the context of Syria. One of them is certainly to kind of explore the extent to which you can start to network and build the capacity of alternative actors to find ways to sort of build alternative forms of, negotiation amongst themselves. Another one would again relate to using aid delivery as an opening for beginning these types of negotiations amongst quite polarized actors across the society.
Martin?
I don't put any faith at all in the feckless political class in Lebanon. I think that the issues are far bigger than them, even if they wanted to confront them. And I do think that there has to be a point, an intersection of the strategic interests of the key players, the Saudis and the Iranians in particular, but also the Russians and to some extent the Americans. Now, what would Iran be prepared to compromise on? If you wanted to game that, it would be what's more important to them in terms of Syria. It's Hezbollah. Hezbollah are the most potent arm of their foreign policy by a long, long way, and the strategic bridgehead that Damascus gives them is essential. They would probably go for something like a deal which retains the systems and structures of, or part of the regime in terms of its support for Hezbollah, but gets rid of Assad and some of the key players. I think that's as much as you could hope for from them, and I'm not sure that goes far enough for Saudi and for America. So, what can be done? There must, if there isn't now, there has to be very soon a mutual recognition that this is absolutely assured destruction of all on all sides. And I do think that the Iranians are starting to see that with this public face of diplomacy that they put out there.
I mean, what I draw from what you've just said is that before formal diplomacy, right, before thinking about Geneva 3 or whatever, you're actually thinking about a job of persuasion to do, which is not only directed at one actor or another, but in general, that the stakes in this are enormously high and that mutual assured destruction is the sort of the destination at the end of the route which we're now on, so it has to change.
That's right, and I think people actually see it, but they think that we're far enough away from it to actually U-turn when we want to.
Soon enough, yeah. Julien?
I agree 100% with Martin. I mean, I think the only way that you can hope to shape this in a more positive direction is through the regional players and their influence on the ground. I think it's going to take a long time, and I think even if they do cut a deal, how does that work out in Syria with the blood that's been shed, with the sectarianism that has emerged? I mean, that doesn't play out quickly. So I think it's a long time for it to play out, but I see it as being the only way of shifting a trajectory eventually. I would say one thing, before you start talking about persuasion, is, the initial step is accepting you can't win. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can't win. And I think, that goes to Martin's point that, what is the alternative? It is mutual destruction. And I think until we accept in the West, amongst the opposition, that there is no winning solution, unfortunately, and that actually you're going to have to deal with the Assad regime in some sense. And the question of the transition, forget about it. Assad's not going anywhere. He's got but he's lost control. Yeah. No, but he's lost control of Syria. So it's a different question.
So we have the option of doing nothing and maintaining Assad in power, and we've tried that. We've had a lab.
But we haven't.
We've done that in Iraq. We've maintained Saddam Hussein in power after '91. We've allowed him to destroy the country. He killed in 2 months more than Assad in 3 years. We did nothing. He kept us busy with dismantling his chemical weapons, and we played along, cat and mouse game it was called at the time. We punished the Iraqis instead with sanctions. We did no-fly zones, which divided the country into 3 parts. We then gave him more power.
I agree. I agree. You can say the same.
So doing nothing has consequence and has a cost. And doing nothing in Syria has a consequence and a cost. The more you keep Assad in power, the more you will get destruction, because he is staying in power because he is destroying.
Okay, but to counter that, let me just finish. You're not doing nothing, because I would argue at the moment you're saying Assad must go, you're pushing that agenda, and you're doing nothing at the moment, effectively.
Yes.
Actually, what I'm saying is that you have to accept that Assad has to be part of the solution, the Iranians have to be part of the solution, and you proactively say they need to be brought in. You proactively don't go to the negotiating table saying the negotiations are about when Assad and the Iranians leave. That's not negotiation. You say, so you proactively shift your approach towards negotiations, which is recognizing that the Iranians are not going anywhere. Assad has a strong support base. He's not going to. How do you engage these actors, although it's they're amoral, into a process whereby they gain some of their interests, the opposition gains some of their interests, the regional powers gain some of it? You cut a deal.
Cutting a deal prolongs the conflict. Yes.
Okay. Let's take a couple more questions and keep on enriching this conversation. One here. I think that what we should do now is take a couple of questions and handle them. Time is always working against us, and usually as the conversation really starts heating up, the questions start piling up, and the clock is ticking.
I'm Carol Story, and I'm a photojournalist. I'm going to ask a question to the panel that hasn't been really raised as a point of discussion, and is ever since we've had the Arab Spring. We look around and we say, who are the visionaries? Who are the future leaders that are going to have influence in the region? What is their thoughts? How are they going to inspire the public? How are they going to inspire and influence the political, socio-economic result of the solution we're trying to find? And from a distance, and we're all very interested in what's happening, that's why we're here tonight, but think of the wider public. What is their knowledge? What influence can they bring to bear on what's happening in the region? And the issue for me that I keep asking is, who are the future leaders? How are they influencing the people? Where is their voice that is going to be able to bring the parties to a table to have very interesting negotiations, rather than a bunch of horses that are going to create a camel that is going to end up creating a dinosaur at the UN or wherever? Yeah. And that's the question I bring to the table. Where do you see the future leaders? Where is the vision going to come from for the region?
That zoology was really interesting. But let's go to the one right next, and we'll take those two, and then see how we're doing for a couple more.
My name is Brian Lapping. I happen just recently to have been rereading Machiavelli's The Prince. And he makes it perfectly plain in his advice to princes that you have to use power skillfully and dominate. And what we are faced with in this region is an area where the Ottoman Empire dominated, and it was quite efficient. And then there was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and there was a succession of messes, and then there was the amazing judgment at the end of the war that said, for example, that the Kurds should not have a state, and lots of other tin-pot little groups here and there should have a state. And looking at what Machiavelli would think about this, I find myself saying, well, what is the great power here that actually can do something? And it seems to me perfectly obvious that it is Iran, and it is Iran that sent Hezbollah down there to dominate the central part of this area, and it is Iran that is determined, and Iran that is quite rich, Iran that has managed, in spite of being absolutely broke, to remain a quite substantial power. Mm-hmm. So I, in a thoroughly ignorant way, find myself thinking, you're going to stop Iran dominating this area?
Okay, so future leaders and Iran and its domination. Choose one. Pick them and go. Martin.
I'll go future leaders.
No, please take Iran.
Well, I'm happy to go Iran, actually. But just on future leaders, I wish I could offer you a vivid landscape there. But I think it's the nature of totalitarian regimes, such as Syria, such as Egypt, that any effective, meaningful opposition is utterly oppressed. And we were all watching with wide eyes 3 years ago in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where 30,000 kids with smartphones did what millions couldn't in years before, and they were tumultuous, truly revolutionary scenes. Where are we now, 3 years down the track? Those youth leaders that were so bold and so vibrant in those days are hiding, or they're imprisoned. It's not to say that they couldn't emerge down the track as potentially someone who could lead the country forward. But when you asked your question, I was thinking across the region of people who really resonate with me as figures who could be potential leaders in the years to come. And I've covered a lot of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakenings for The Guardian, and met a lot of people, and I honestly can't come up with too many that really do resonate with me as leaders of the future. Not to say they're not there, potentially I haven't met them, but they're not at the forefront of my mind.
I've been in Britain for 37 years, and I can't see a future leader either.
Okay. That's the scariest thing. That's, you don't have a Nelson Mandela. You don't have the mind of Thomas Jefferson.
Sarah. Victoria?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that you can't just hope that you're going to find this new kind of breed of people that didn't exist there and they're going to solve all the issues. It's not going to happen. But what you can do is work with what is there and see if you can find ways of trying to, if you like, model different approaches to doing politics and supporting them to change the grain, if you like, working with the grain to change the grain, to use an alert phrase.
They've got to be nurtured, they've got to be encouraged, and above all, they need to be given the political space to mature and to grow, and that's just not happening.
But, I mean, to strike a more positive note, I mean, I lived in Syria for 3 years, and the level of, I mean, you couldn't engage with people, and the police state was on top of you. People weren't allowed to express themselves in any meaningful way in so many areas of life, let alone politics. And today, in a sense, the Syrian population has been unleashed. So, I mean, one can say, yes, there are no distinct Mandelas that one sees on the horizon, but there's a whole people that have discovered a kind of a political awakening which was kept away from them for so long. And I think, there are hundreds of leaders out there. I mean, but in a positive way. I mean, there are doctors who have stood up. There are local civil society people who have stood up. I mean, there are lots of people who are doing, whether they can emerge as people around which others can rally and something can be created. But I think at least amidst the despair, one can say there are these seeds of a better hope for the Syrian people to express themselves, to shape their future in a more meaningful way.
Empowered to a sense, and I partly agree with that, but I would add, how many of those people that you speak to are prepared to put their names to quotes?
No. Today the men with guns dominate.
Okay, Nadim?
Well, I think this is a sort of question from the last century, or a question from the last millennium even. We don't live in an era of leaders. I mean, the leader of Europe is Herman van Rompuy. It's no longer it's no longer the Churchills or the De Gaulles or Nasser or Assad I mean, so there are remnants of the last century. But I think we are seeing a global change in that sense, and a global change in the role of the state as well. I mean, we have to get used to living without the welfare state here too, not just in Syria and in Iraq and other places.
Victoria muttered to me a moment ago that she had a positive example, so that's why I'm giving a flash of this answer.
I think it's an interesting example because it's a little bit more optimistic, and it's an example of what I was talking about before, the working with the grain to change the grain. In Lebanon, one of the things that we're doing is to work with the leaders of political parties, the youth sections of political parties, and what they're beginning to do now is actually quite interesting because they're moving a step away from doing the politics as usual, which is very partisan and using, identity and all these things, to actually discuss issues that relate to constituencies' everyday lives, from issues that relate to security to issues that relate with oil and gas revenue management, which can actually resonate to daily life improvement. In a sense. I think that's quite significant.
So, I mean, part of what seems to be being said is that of course, there is interest in the big issues. Of course, there are people who, when the opportunity seems there and the conditions seem right, show energy and vision. But what you have is a system and a structure which works against that the whole time.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's entrenched.
And it's entrenched. And as you've been saying, you know, you have a country which has not been a nation state all the way since independence. So you've got those systems deeply entrenched. Yet you still have the possibility amongst people of the way that they think and of what they aspire to.
It's a different definition of a nation state. A nation state is a group of people who want to live together. It's not a group of people who are the same horoscope and the same religion and the same ethnic group. And it was difficult. I mean, Lebanon is probably, I mean, for people who are familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian question, Lebanon is a one-state solution. So it's hard work, but and it takes time, and we've had the time to develop it in Lebanon, and that's what's keeping the countries stable. It's not satisfactory.
And if you had looked at Lebanon in 1988, you would have said there is no end to this. There is no Lebanon. There is no government. There are actually two people who call themselves prime ministers at the moment. There's the Lebanese state idea that it could protect the people or look after people's interests. Forget it completely. This place is a nightmare, a badlands. And a couple of years after that, the situation changed because the major actors decided that it needed to change. So there's also the point that, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel isn't always the light from the oncoming train. Sometimes there are actually grounds for hope. So time, as I said, is somewhat against us. We're finishing a little bit late, which is allowing for the fact that we started a little bit late. The way that I like to finish these gatherings, well, first of all, it doesn't finish here because you're all invited for a drink and a snack downstairs afterwards. So the meeting and the discussion in that sense can continue and should continue. But this part of it, I like to finish by asking each one of the panelists the same question. And partly I am an absolutely committed optimist. I sometimes think that I am paid for being an optimist. And with that thought in mind, sitting in the background, imagine yourself in a situation where you are sitting with somebody or some group of power and influence in the area of this set of problems that we've been talking about. And you've got a minute and a half with them. Right? This is an opportunity not to be missed. Who is it? And what do you say? Martin.
Well, one name that's come up a couple of times tonight, and it goes to the question asked earlier, is Qasem Soleimani. And for those of you who don't know him, many of you probably would have seen the mid-90s thriller, The Usual Suspects. There was a figure, Kaiser Soze, in that. And he was the enemy within that, or the bad guy, or the villain within that nobody knew, because he was so skilled at what he did. And I've long referred to him as the Kaiser Soze of the Middle East. He's very skilled at a unique blend of I guess, diplomacy and pointy-headed military or subversive tactics. He's a very significant player in the region. He saw the Americans off in Iraq. He's doing very well in Syria, and he's extremely important strategically to Hezbollah. I would ask him, what does he want? What's it going to take? How does this end? What do you need to bring this to a halt? I see him as, if not the most influential figure in the region, right up there. And I would simply want to get into his mind and say, what would it take for you to call off the hounds here? What would it take for you to sit at a table with people and bring this to an end?
Brilliant. Nadim?
Well, I think that the most influential person in the region now is President Obama, and he's absent from the scene, and all it would take is for him to pay attention to this and take the United States interests into consideration. So I think he's been the main blockage on that. It's his weakness that's strengthening people like Qasem Soleimani and Putin and others to step in and control the situation.
So 90 seconds that you need to develop a 90-second case to give to Obama to explain Americans' interests in the region and what they should do.
Well,
I'm not telling you need to develop it now. Sorry, I was looking at a possible project for the next few months. Victoria.
I'm going to bring it back to Lebanon. I mean, I think definitely it's a small state, and there's a lot of global and regional influence that is very important in decision making in country. But I think it's also important to recognize that internal actors do have agency, and to put responsibility on them as well to take action in a certain direction. So I would sit at the next national dialogue table and plead with them to uphold the dissociation policy and
pay attention and take responsibility. Exactly. Yeah. Julien.
Martin and Nadim took the two people I was going to go for. So I guess the third one maybe in that equation that's a good one, would be Assad himself, I guess, and to ask the same question that Martin was posing. What would it take? What are you looking for? And I think the bewildering thing in many ways for Assad is that he's clearly, he's never missed an opportunity to push back any hope of engaging with people on the ground within Syria that he could potentially cut a deal with. So what does Assad want, and what could he do? What would it take for him to come to the table? And beyond that, as Nadim just said, I think the fourth person in this, as Martin just said, the fourth person in this equation would be Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia.
Right. Important. So I mean, a certain amount of it is to do with action at the diplomatic level, and part of what you're saying is to really try to find out what the stakes are, who wants what, what it would take. So it's the groundwork for a lot of that sort of, as I said, hard diplomatic graft. And then it's also about politics, and it's about taking political responsibility. And that, I think, I mean, in some senses, that's what Nadim was saying about President Obama. It's what Victoria is saying about political leaders in Lebanon.
Can I add one thing? I mean, you cannot separate politics from diplomacy. Politics is like a battle of wills. It's like a poker game, and if you go to the table showing all your cards, saying I have nothing, of course you lose, and that's the position of the Americans now.
Right. So I think that one of the things which I take away from this whole discussion so far is that the solution in the long term is Syrian, but that is long term. So it still remains to be sure that in the meantime the maximum is being done with the resources needed and in the best possible way to meet some of those short-term needs and to prevent the situation from boiling over. But treating the symptoms is only going to be Band-Aid. I guess the case I would make is the Band-Aid is important. It's actually fundamental, because if the situation does boil over, then part of what you've been saying is the stakes here are enormous, and perhaps we have only barely touched on that. I want to thank all four panelists. I want to thank all of you for making the effort to come out, people who asked questions for asking such good questions, the people who didn't ask questions for being patient and listening to the other folks' questions even when you wanted to ask them, those of you who wanted to ask and didn't get to ask and buttonhole somebody downstairs over a drink. Thank you very much and good evening.